Stanford University.
Welcome to the 9th Lorenz Eitner Lecture in Classical Art and Culture, a lecture series that has been created to promote and publicize and disseminate classical scholarship, especially for a wider audience. So if you're not a paid-up classicist, you're especially welcome, and we're glad you're here. The series has been made possible over the years by Peter and Lindsay Joost, who are great friends and loyal supporters of our classics program. They're both here today. Once again, many thanks for making all this possible. The series is named in honor of Lorenz Eitner, who was a distinguished art historian here on campus. He ran what is now the Cantor Center from the 1960s till the end of the 80s. Helped turn the museum into a leading regional art collection. He was very distinguished. He wrote about a dozen books on art and art history. He also chaired what was then the Department of Art and Architecture. And given his interests, it's very fitting that our speaker today is the world-famous archaeologist, Brian Rose, who comes here from the University of Pennsylvania, and who will be introduced by the latest addition to our faculty, Professor Justin Leitwanger, in his capacity as a fellow archaeologist and in a former life, a student of Professor Rose.
Thank you, Walter. It's a great honor and pleasure to introduce our guest today, our Eitner Lecturer, Brian Rose. A graduate of Haverford College and Columbia University, Brian comes to us from the University of Pennsylvania, where he is the James B. Pritchard Professor of Archaeology, the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the storied Penn Museum, and Curator in charge of its Mediterranean section. No fedoras, but he wears many hats. Always engaged in a busy program of fieldwork. In recent years, he directed the Granicus River Valley Survey Project and serves as co-director for the long-standing Gordian excavation project, both in Turkey. No doubt he is best known, though, for his work at the fabled site of Troy, where he has headed post-Bronze Age excavations for more than 20 years. Brian's intellectual interests are broad, chronologically, geographically, and thematically. So too is the archaeological, iconographic, and literary evidence he weaves together to shed light on historical problems, whether it's the rise of new Greco-Persian burial customs, the reappropriation of foreigner imagery in Augustan Rome, or that burning question asked more often than can be answered, was there a Trojan War? It is always imperative in these situations to draw attention to one's published contributions, and indeed Brian's range equally broadly. Most recently, new and forthcoming volumes on Gordian and Troy, including the much anticipated monograph, The Archaeology of Greek and Roman Troy, which apparently is actually more broadly ranging from the Neolithic to Gallipoli. Again, quite broad. Coming very soon, next month, I understand, to a bookstore near you. His generosity, not only as a colleague, but as a mentor and teacher, is rightly famous. I am fortunate to count myself among that lucky group of students. I don't think I've heard him say no to a request for his time and energy, if possible, within the constraints of space and time. Nor is that guidance limited to such mundane details as dissertations and exams. Rather, it embraces such practical issues as how to navigate Turkish village customs and how to avoid Italian tear gas, which I'm not sure I actually remember, I don't remember which direction to go, but I know if you're tear gassed in downtown Rome, I know it's not in the low-lying confined space of the Largo, Argentina, though. To the Tiber, flee to the Tiber. With such talents and energy, Brian's accomplishments and accolades are many. Fellowships from the American Academy in Rome, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, the Max Planck Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Academy in Berlin, the Crest Foundation, the American Research Institute in Turkey, the Center for Hellenic Studies, and on and on and on. No one will be surprised then that his service extends to many of these institutions as well. Formerly president of the Archaeological Institute of America, now trustee, on the board of directors of the American Research Institute in Turkey, and for a decade its vice president, trustee of the American Academy in Rome, and various other leadership service at the American Council of Learned Societies, the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, and others. As president and face of the Archaeological Institute of America for 5 years, Brian championed the AIA's mission to excavate, educate, and advocate. His remarkable zeal and seemingly boundless energies evidence themselves in efforts to engage the public as stewards of cultural heritage. You could catch him on TV answering questions about Homer's Troy and Schliemann's Troy in the wake of Hollywood's Troy. I draw attention to one accomplishment that will be of particular relevance for his topic tonight, his own archaeological tours of duty across military bases in the US, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Here he initiated a program to educate troops about local heritage and advocate with those military powers that be, whose decisions have direct and dramatic implications for objects and sites during wartime. Quite an accomplishment for a pacifist graduate of a Quaker college. It is this embracing of a critical but often overlooked responsibility of archaeologists that forms a persistent theme. The challenge to leave behind one's intellectual comfort zone, to communicate beyond the walls of academia, and to engage directly and respectfully with a public that should and often does care about its own stake in the material record of our collective past. His manner of making the past relevant to the present, not in some tangential or abstract way, but in an immediate and intensely meaningful way, will be obvious in the next hour. So please join me in welcoming to Stanford our Eitner Lecture, Brian Rose.
Thanks to all of you in the Stanford community for making me feel so welcome during the last 2 days. The subject on which I'm going to speak tonight, I'm going to speak on a series of subjects involving museums, repatriation, and the protection of cultural property in conflict zones. And this talk is very much an autobiographical one, because during the last 10 years, I don't know that there's been a time that I haven't been dealing with museum issues, repatriation issues, and especially issues of the protection of cultural property in Iraq and Afghanistan, although other countries as well. This is really a talk that divides into two parts, one involving museums and repatriation, and is very much connected to my role at the Penn Museum as curator. The other involves Iraq and Afghanistan and issues of cultural heritage protection there, but I'll try to bring them both together within the same sphere, dealing with cultural property protection. People, of course, have been excavating antiquity and showcasing it for a very long time. One of the interesting discoveries I made at Troy was that in the early Hellenistic period, builders who were transforming the city of Troy, or Ilion, as it was known during the Greek and Roman period, apparently found Bronze Age artifacts, which they then put in the Temple of Athena, which you see reconstructed on the left, and showcased it as a treasury linked to the Trojan War. So in other words, these objects of Bronze Age date that they excavated were turned into Homeric relics that were part of the marketing campaign of Troy to sell itself as the location of the Trojan War. And of course, throughout history, throughout the medieval period and the Renaissance, we hear of great monuments of antiquity that were found and showcased. One monument from the 16th century that I show you on the right, staying with the Trojan theme, the Laocoon, probably of early imperial date, that was found in the early 16th century, and of course showcased in the Papal Palace. And at the same time, as you well know, the marble plan of Rome was found, something that Stanford has done so much to clarify. But the first extensive excavations and the first showcasing of objects that were found on a major scale, on a really grand scale, took place in the 18th century, specifically in Pompeii and Herculaneum during the reign of Charles VII, the king of Naples and Sicily. He realized that his backyard, which was Pompeii and Herculaneum, could yield statues of the sort that you see on lower left, one of the bronzes from the Villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum, which he could then use to decorate his villas and his palaces, such as the one at Caserta near Naples on lower right. There was a series or a system of aristocratic competition in operation during this period, the same kind of system of aristocratic competition that you would have seen in ancient Rome with the conquering generals who were coming back from their campaigns of conquest in Greece and Asia Minor, in North Africa, South Italy, and Sicily, bringing back and showcasing as many antiquities or as many great works of art as they could possibly find and transport. And so with the kings and queens of Europe, you find the same sort of system in operation. Who could find the greatest number of pieces of the greatest periods of antiquity and showcase them as a unit, thereby showing that they were the culmination of all of these great epics of earlier history. And during this same period, we get the great public museums being established shortly after the beginning of excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum. So I've only put down a few of those founded in the second half of the 18th century, the British Museum, the Vatican, the Hermitage, the Louvre. There are plenty of others. And of course, this wouldn't happen for another century in America with the founding of the Metropolitan Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in 1870. But with these museums, which were intended to be encyclopedic museums, they needed a great number of antiquities in order to fill the new galleries. That meant they needed either to excavate new sites or to find material on the art market. And so began a whole series of excavations intended to fill those galleries, and again to showcase the greatest epics of earlier history. One of the issues that came into play shortly thereafter were the wars of liberation in the 19th century and changes in the boundaries that had been in place for a considerable period of time. So in the course of the 19th century, Italy becomes unified during the campaign of Garibaldi, whom you see in upper left. And of course, Greece is liberated from the Ottoman Empire as of the 1830s. And one of the byproducts of these wars of liberation, in many cases, were the formulation of new antiquities laws. So this is not so surprising. With wars of liberation and an increase in nationalism, there's a new outlook on the cultural property in those countries, and new laws associated with cultural property. So the Greek antiquities laws begin in the 1830s. Those in Italy will not begin until 1902, but still in Italy it was not easy to export from archaeological sites as much material as had been possible at an earlier time. But it was relatively easy to export what you found in Turkey, or the former, what was at that time the Ottoman Empire. And so we get a number of great excavations beginning in Turkey in the second half of the 19th century. This is when Heinrich Schliemann, whom you see in upper right, goes to Troy to begin a series of campaigns of excavation stretching between 1870 and 1890. It's also the time in which the excavations at Pergamon begin. And you're seeing a fairly recent aerial view of Troy in the lower part of the image. When Heinrich Schliemann began excavating here, he was hoping to find evidence for the Trojan War, to prove that this site was the site or the location where the Trojan War had actually occurred. And in the course of his excavation, he found in the early Bronze Age levels, the mid-3rd millennium BC levels of the site, a hoard of gold, silver, bronze, lapis lazuli, rock crystal, iron, carnelian, a whole host of materials that he grouped together under the rubric, the treasure of Priam. And he claimed that this was his proof, the proof that he had been searching for, that the site in which he was digging was Homer's Troy. In fact, we now know that it was 1,000 years too early for a period that would have involved, or would potentially have involved, conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittites, or residents of what is modern-day Turkey. But nevertheless, it made Heinrich Schliemann famous overnight, it made the site of Troy famous overnight, and it made his wife Sophia Schliemann famous overnight. As you see, he drapes some of the jewelry from the treasure of Priam on the head and shoulders of his wife, the diadem, the earrings, necklace. And you see it on the left on Sophia Schliemann, and on the right as it would look now if you were to go to the museum and view it. And there were a number of other objects that he found, quite a number of other objects, as you see in the lower part of this image, what we call a sauce boat, pins with these paratactic jugs on the top, globular vessels, a lapis lazuli axe, the sort of treasure that was not so atypical in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, but nevertheless one of great importance. And it certainly showed the extent to which Troy was part of a network of far-reaching trade routes already by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. That treasure was stolen by Schliemann from the Ottoman Empire. So at the time in which he found it, he did not tell the authorities of the Ottoman Empire. He smuggled it out of the country and ultimately to Germany, where he gave it as a gift to the German people. And it was housed in the Museum for Pre- and Proto-History, the Museum für Vor- und Frühgeschichte, for a very long time, and disappeared mysteriously at the end of World War II, at the time in which Soviet soldiers sacked the city at the end of the war. You see Soviets marching through Berlin in the upper slide, and the Reichstag, the ruined Reichstag, in the background. And many of us thought that that treasure had been melted down, which was a fate that befell so many ancient treasures in the course of war, then as well as now. But it showed up miraculously in the basement of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow in 1991, so 46 years after it had disappeared. You see in the lower image, I've taken you to the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. Here is the diadem that Sophia Schliemann had been wearing, one of the sauce boats, globular vessels, and Madame Irina Antonova, the director of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. She was director of the museum at the time in which the treasure was brought there by Soviet soldiers who had orders to take it from Berlin in 1945 and bring it back to Moscow. And she's still director of the Pushkin Museum. Even as we sit here, she is director of the Pushkin Museum, which tells you something about occupational longevity in the former Soviet Union. But when the treasure's whereabouts were made known in the context of perestroika, glasnost, the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, she did exactly what one would have wanted her to have done. She had the treasure conserved, she put it on exhibit, it was published anew. A great deal of attention was lavished on Troy at that point, also on our excavations. The Discovery Channel did not knock on our door every day, but they did in the early 90s as a consequence of this treasure having been reintroduced to the scholarly world. This wasn't the only treasure that had been looted from Troy and from the surrounding area, that of the Northeast Aegean, in earlier times. In 1966, there was a gold assemblage of jewelry of seemingly early Bronze Age date, middle of the 3rd millennium BC, so let's say 2500, 2400 BC, that came on the art market. And you see some of the components of that treasure on the screen, consisting of earrings, a pin, diadem, pendants, necklace, very similar to the treasure of Priam that Schliemann had found and removed from Troy. When this came on the market in 1966, the Penn Museum, which is my institution and which you see on lower left, made a decision to acquire it for the price of $10,000. That got a sigh. It's now worth considerably more. The curator in charge of the Mediterranean section, Rodney Young, feared that if he didn't buy it, that it would be broken up on the art market and that it would never be adequately published. So he bought it, and it became one of the treasures of the Penn Museum in a sense. It was published immediately, and the man who published it, the curator, one of the curators of the Mediterranean section, George Bass, who's known to many of you as the founder of underwater archaeology, said that he couldn't say with certainty where it had come from. Certainly it was looted. No one denied that. And it seemed to have been looted from the Northeast Aegean. No one denied that either. But the exact provenance could not be ascertained because in the early Bronze Age, there was no hard and fast division between what is now northwestern Turkey and what are now the Greek islands in the Northeast Aegean. It was one common style that pervaded the entire region. So, for example, if I show you the pin known to be from Troy, the one that Schliemann had found, which you see at the bottom on the left, and then the one from Penn that we had in this assemblage from 1966, you can see the strong similarities between the two. If, however, I take you a little further afield, and if you look first at the map, we've been here at Troy, and I'm now taking you a little further to the west, to the Greek island of Lemnos, so part of the modern Republic of Greece, and to the early Bronze Age site of Polyokni. If you look at their early Bronze Age treasure, which is also of gold, and specifically at the bracelets, you can see the one from Polyokni and the one from Penn, very similar in style, and the same can be said for the so-called basket earrings, Polyokni on the left and Penn Museum on the right. So as George Bass said in his original publication, one couldn't say with certainty whether it had been plundered from what is now Greece or from what is now Turkey, although he admitted that it must have been plundered from one of those two areas. And I should also say that at that time, in 1966, he did speak to the antecedent of the Turkish Ministry of Culture to let them know that the museum was planning to purchase it, and no objection was raised. So it was assumed that this was a non-controversial purchase. Nevertheless, it did start a chain reaction among the curators of the museum, and they began discussing whether or not it was appropriate to purchase artifacts that didn't have an archaeological provenance. And in 1970, they formulated a kind of manifesto, something called the Pennsylvania Declaration, on April 1st, 1970, which you see on upper right, saying that as of then, they would no longer buy undocumented antiquities. And this was a decision that was made, in essence, as a byproduct of the museum's earlier decision to purchase the so-called Trojan Gold, analogous to that of Schliemann. And 1 week later, the International Council of Museums, ICOM, made a decision to promote the same sort of policy, not buying any antiquities that didn't have an archaeological provenance. And then 7 months later, 1970 was a banner year in cultural property legislation. UNESCO formulated its so-called UNESCO Convention on the illicit trafficking of cultural property, saying essentially the same thing that the Pennsylvania Declaration had said or advocated for, and ICOM. Meanwhile, no one was making any claim on the so-called Troy Gold in the Penn Museum. And when I came to Penn, which was in 2005, the first thing I did had been in the depots, and I said, let's put this on display, for heaven's sakes. Whether it's from Lemnos or whether it's from Troy, it's one of our great treasures, and we can use it as part of our teaching, because we all touch on Troy in one way or another in the course of our classes. So I put it on display, and I also invited one of my colleagues at Troy, Ernst Pernichka, whom you see in upper right, an archaeometallurgist from the University of Tübingen, to come to Philadelphia with his colleague Hermann Born to analyze the gold, because with objects that are bought on the art market, you're never certain beyond a shadow of a doubt that they're genuine or that it's a unified assemblage. They had both recently examined the so-called treasure of Priam in Moscow at the Pushkin Museum, and so I wanted them to look at our gold to see the extent to which it was similar to what the Pushkin Museum had now put on display. And they pronounced it all genuine, was all the same sort of gold, so they thought it was a unified assemblage of early Bronze Age date, again, middle of the 3rd millennium BC. And then in one of the pendants, they found a particle of earth, a kind of grain of sand, and they analyzed it, and it was found to contain extraordinarily high levels of arsenic, compatible with the equally extraordinarily high levels of arsenic in the soil of Troy. So this was a kind of smoking gun. This was the first time that we had had seemingly, I won't say convincing, but persuasive evidence that the hoard had originally been found in Troy or in the area around Troy. And I asked Ernst Pernichka about high arsenic levels on Lemnos, which in my position you would have asked as well, or southeastern Bulgaria, because I wanted to try to get an idea of how definitive this evidence was. And he said that he thought the arsenic levels in Troy the high levels of arsenic at Troy and the Trojan soil were not matched by Lemnos and by southeastern Bulgaria, but one would really have to do a test to be absolutely certain. We waited a while before publicizing this discovery, but we did publicize it. We're a public museum, and so we alerted the reporters to the research that had just been conducted on the so-called Trojan Gold. And you see the article that appeared in January of 2010, raising the question of whether or not the gold could be from Troy. And after that happened, I waited for a shoe to drop, for someone to call me on the phone, specifically from Turkey, and to say, can we get together and talk? And nothing happened. And so I didn't think there was any more to it. And then 1 year later, I did receive a call from the Consul General's office, the Turkish Consul General's office in New York, asking if they could come to see the Trojan Gold. And I said, of course. So they sat down, and one of their guests said to me, "You probably wonder why a lawyer is in the room." And I didn't know he was a lawyer. And I said, "Well, I assume you have an interest in antiquity. I mean, what lawyer doesn't have an interest in antiquity?" And he said, "No, you don't understand. I want to see the dossier involving the acquisition of the Trojan Gold." And I thought, well. Okay, so, you know, in such a situation, of course, you call the university legal counsel and you say, we're paid a call by someone from the Turkish Consul General's office, and they want to see this dossier. And so we did give them the dossier. There was nothing to hide. We had also, as I told you, in 1966 approached the antecedent of the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism, which at that point was still the Ministry of Education. And the lawyer subsequently told us that he was going to recommend that no further action be taken, and that the treasure should simply stay at Penn, because it couldn't be established beyond a shadow of a doubt that it didn't come from Lemnos, or in theory southeastern Bulgaria, although that one was weak, or conceivably Lesbos. I mean, there were a number of potential sites from which it could have come. And so we're now in August of 2011, and I went on sabbatical thinking that everything was okay. I went to Rome to the American Academy, and then in late September 2011, I received an email from the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism saying, "Hi. We were thinking of coming to the Penn Museum, and we'd love to see the Troy Gold." And I said, "Well, I'm in Rome, but I can set this up for you, of course." So they came and looked at the gold and said, "We want to claim this for repatriation." And that, for me, was a surprise, because nothing had happened in the intervening 46 years, and also because Turkey had been approached at the time of acquisition in 1966, and there had been no reaction at the time, nor had there been when the gold was published again, when the Treasure of Priam in Moscow was publicized as a result of, again, Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms. And I immediately went to Ankara and I said to them, "But this was acquired 4 years before the UNESCO convention, because we had always been taught that 1970, the year of the UNESCO convention, was a line in the sand. And if something had been purchased before 1970, before that convention, no one would claim it for repatriation. If it was first published after 1970 and had no documentation, then it might be claimed for repatriation." And it was then that I was told that UNESCO was no longer the line in the sand that I thought it was, or that they were respecting. They began to cite the Ottoman Antiquities Law of 1906, which was a new one for me. And so we began a series of negotiations that lasted for a year, an eventful year. And I went back and forth to Ankara in the course of that year. It was the first time that I found myself on this side of the desk, I have to say. During the period when I was president of the AIA, I testified frequently before the President's Cultural Property Advisory Committee on memorandums of understanding between other countries and the US, and always testified in favor of stronger cultural property legislation. But this was the first time any case of this sort had actually touched me. It was also a point when the director of the Penn Museum was planning to leave, and so this was Richard Hodges, who was a wonderful director, but he was on his way out the door and the new director hadn't been chosen yet. So it was a liminal time, and I had to try to find a solution that would be acceptable to the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism and to the trustees of the University of Pennsylvania, because it wasn't my decision to make as to whether or not the gold would go back to Turkey. It wasn't the museum's decision to make. This was legally the property of the trustees of the University of Pennsylvania. And so the president of the university, Amy Gutman, had to render a decision as to what should happen. And this was, if I'm being honest, and especially speaking to the graduate students, this was one of the worst times in my life. I mean, the gray hair I have now, all from that year. Before then, there wasn't anything. And I couldn't find a way through the problems. I couldn't find a way to satisfy the president's office and to satisfy the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. And there were those of us in the museum who became a little desperate because we weren't quite sure what to do. I should add that although the treasure was purchased for $10,000 in 1966, it was now valued at about $10 million, so it wasn't an insignificant amount. So what did we do in terms of the exhibit? We changed the rubric from the gold of Troy to Bronze Age gold. I'm not proud of this. So I changed the title from place to time. But as you'll notice, one only had to go to the fine print to read, as you see, History of Troy, Jewelry of Troy, and Sophia Schliemann's face gracing the poster just as it had before. So this didn't satisfy anyone except make me look ridiculous. So in the end, I was able to find a compromise that was acceptable to the president's office and also acceptable to the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. And I can say more about this during the question and answer session, but in essence, the museum did not surrender legal title to the treasure. The president said that the university couldn't because you couldn't build an entire case for repatriation on this one grain of sand, which again was the primary piece of evidence that it had come from Troy. But it could go on indefinite loan to Turkey with the expectation that we would never see it again. And that, in fact, is what happened. So it did go to Turkey, where it is now. You see it here in the Ankara Museum as of about a year ago, along with a label that leaves out the notion that it's on indefinite loan, but it says some very kind things about the Penn Museum. In return, we received guarantees that Turkey would support strongly our excavations at Gordian in the center of the country, where I've been co-director since 2007. And we also secured the loan of material that had been found in the so-called Midas Mound, what we now think is the tomb of Midas's father, that would come to the Penn Museum for a year-long exhibit in 2016 with pledges of other long-term loans of objects that would travel from Turkey to Penn in the future. And so with this agreement in hand, we both signed it. The treasure went back to Turkey, and it was the best possible solution that we could have arrived at, I think. I couldn't find anything else that would be of agreement to both sides. This claim for repatriation of objects, some of which have been out of the country of origin for a very long time, of course, is part of a much larger trend. You need only look at recent repatriations involving Greece and Italy and the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Getty and a number of other museums to get a sense of this. These antiquities, which have returned, and you see one of the more famous ones in upper right, the Euphronius crater, having returned to the Villa Giulia in Rome in 2008. When these objects return, they're made part of a larger exhibition, which is opened with great fanfare and with unusual titles. So you see in the case of the antiquities returned to Italy on upper left, they are called Nostoy. So they're analogized to the Homeric heroes who have returned home after a convoluted set of wanderings. So the heroes are analogized to the travels of the antiquities themselves. And you also see this showing up increasingly frequently on blog posts, especially as you see in lower right, a number of antiquities in the British Museum that have been linked to the label, "I am Greek and I want to go home." You see this frequently, not just for Italy and Greece, but for a wide variety of countries. And what's become increasingly clear is that 1970 is no longer the line in the sand that we had all expected it to be, nor is the 1906 Antiquities Law. So a recent request for repatriation is the so-called old fisherman statue from Aphrodisias, now in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, which arrived in Berlin in 1905. And it has been requested by the Turkish Ministry of Culture. Now, this is 1905. It's a year before the Ottoman Antiquities Law of 1906. So it's clear that objects that have been taken from the country of origin, regardless of the time in which they have been taken from the country of origin, are now being requested. And similar requests have been made, as you see here, of the Louvre, the British Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum, of objects that have been out of the country long before 1970. Obviously, many are concerned about this because if there is no line in the sand, then where do you stop? Some have said, well, should we go all the way back to the Fourth Crusade, for example, to the early 13th century, the Fourth Crusade of 1204, when the Venetians sacked Constantinople and took an enormous amount of material back to Venice. Should all of that be repatriated to Istanbul, even though what Istanbul is now is very different from what Constantinople was in 1204? So where do you stop? I mean, it's a conundrum that will give you a headache, the likes of which you've never experienced before. The only ones who will be happy about this will be the lawyers who can buy another country house, because the litigation surrounding this kind of case is going to go on for years. Countries have now begun building museums that are in and of themselves arguments for repatriation. Many of you are familiar with the Acropolis Museum in Athens, where there are gaps which are intended to be filled by antiquities that, in their view, may one day be repatriated from the museum in another country that now holds them. And in this case, the Acropolis Museum is hoping that the British Museum will repatriate the antiquities from the Parthenon. So you have these gaps, which are like empty thrones that ideally will one day be covered with the antiquities. And the same sort of thing will happen with the new Troy Museum. You're seeing again an aerial view of Troy in upper left. Here's the Hellespont or the Dardanelles. Here's the Gallipoli Peninsula, the Mound of Troy, and this is the site of the new Troy Museum and the rendering of the new Troy Museum, which is under construction now. That too will have gaps, open spaces for the antiquities from Troy that now sit in other countries. And of course, there are enormous number of antiquities from Troy that are in other countries, specifically the Treasure of Priam in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. This focus on museums, on galleries that are empty and shouldn't be empty, is something that's been very much in the news in the context of the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, because the museums there have suffered so grievously in the course of the combat that has surrounded them. And I show you here only the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad. After the looting in 2003, you see it on upper left. Donnie George, the former director, now unfortunately a deceased director of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, mourning the destruction of the cultural property in the museum. And of course, it's not just the museums in these countries that have been looted and emptied of their contents, it's also the archaeological sites in the countries where the war has occurred. If you have war ongoing, then it's extraordinarily difficult to patrol the borders, and antiquities can leave the country very easily. And so there has been a wholesale robbery of the archaeological sites of Iraq and Afghanistan, as there now is, of course, in Syria. And you see the extent of this robbery. These are all pits looking like the craters of the moon, pits that have been dug by the looters, hoping they'll find something around the buildings that have been legitimately excavated by archaeologists that they'll be able to sell on the art market. This is the Iraqi site of Zabalam in southern Iraq from the 3rd millennium BC. All of this came to me in 2003 when I was president-elect of the AIA. There was concern that we weren't doing as much as we should to protect the cultural heritage of these two countries. We needed to do more, and what were we going to do? Well, everyone knew that more should be done to protect the cultural heritage, but the question was what to do. And I thought, really, someone should do something. And then suddenly that someone was me, because the president of the AIA, Jane Waldbaum, had said to me, I'm putting you in charge of the war desk at AIA. There, of course, had never been a war. I mean, there had been a war desk, but that was in World War II. There hadn't been a war desk for a very long period of time. And to put someone who had gone to a Quaker college in charge of the war desk was a surprise to me. And she said, you figure out what to do. And the only thing I could think of was to bring the archaeologists from Iraq and Afghanistan to one of the AIA APA meetings, our professional organizations meetings, to let us know what we could do that would make a positive contribution toward the protection of cultural heritage in their countries. And so I brought them to San Francisco, as it happens, in January of 2004. Donnie George, again, the former director of the Iraq Museum, and in upper left, Abdulwasi Firouzi, who was the head of the Afghanistan Antiquity Service. And I said, what can we do that will make a difference? And it was Abdulwasi Firouzi who said, the soldiers who are deploying to Afghanistan, at least, have no idea of the importance of Afghanistan in antiquity. They don't understand that it was part of Eastern Greece, which is in fact what it was after the campaigns of Alexander. They don't know the history of the contributions to civilization from Afghanistan. And so you need to find a way to tell them that, because if they don't learn that, if they don't understand it and really take it on board, then they won't protect the cultural sites, the museums, the libraries, the archaeological sites with the care that those sites require. And I said, well, why don't I start a lecture series where archaeologists go to military bases throughout the country and also to Iraq and Afghanistan, and we'll do cultural heritage sensitivity briefings or training. And he said, great, you do that. Then I had to figure out how to do it, because I had no idea how to do any of what I've just said. And I looked to see what sort of history there was at AIA for interface with the military. And there hadn't been one for a very long time, not since World War II, the period of the Monuments Men, soon to be a major motion picture starring George Clooney, as it happens, opening in December. This was a period when you have academics, archaeologists, art historians, classicists working with the military on the retrieval and repatriation and conservation of works of art and antiquity that had been looted by the Nazis. And so you see in this image of the Monuments Men on the left, here's James Rorimer, who would later be director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There were plenty of famous conservators and art historians, archaeologists in general who were part of this. And so the AIA had a very strong link with the armed forces at that point. And then it all changed during the Vietnam War, when the academics, rather than working with the military, were marching against them. This, of course, was true at Stanford, as it was at Berkeley, as it was at almost every university in the country. The professors joined the students, and everyone marched against the war. And suddenly, academics were viewed with suspicion. They weren't potential partners in the protection of cultural heritage. They were just as much the enemy as anyone else, or could be construed as such. And so there was no history of the AIA interfacing with the military. There hadn't been since 1945. I had to figure out a way to put it in place again. And the only thing I could think of was to turn to Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, who was in charge of repatriating the antiquities that had been stolen from the Iraq Museum after 2003. You see him on the left pulling out part of the Worka vase from a blue ice chest. You see the vase in the center and the vase as it was returned to the Iraq Museum on the left. And the antiquities that he successfully was able to find and repatriate to the museum on the right. He had gone to graduate school with me at Columbia, studying ancient history and law. He's a district attorney in Manhattan. He's the one who prosecuted Puff Daddy for whatever it was that Puff Daddy was alleged to have done. And so I hadn't spoken to him in 25 years, but I didn't know anyone else to call who could help me liaise with the military. I should say that the first thing I did was to say to myself, well, to get permission for this, I probably need to write to the Department of Defense. So I suppose I need to write to Donald Rumsfeld, who was in charge of the Department of Defense then. And I wrote a very nice, cordial letter to Donald Rumsfeld that I'm sure was never opened, and explaining what I wanted to do, and that obviously yielded nothing. So then I talked to Matthew. I called him on the phone at home after 25 years and said, "Hello, Matthew, remember me from 25 years ago? I need your help. I want to start a lecture program, and I don't know how to interface with the military." And he said, "Okay, don't write Donald Rumsfeld. He won't open your letter," as indeed he still hasn't. "You need to liaise with the U.S. Central Command, and I'll help you get this through the channels through which you need to go." And he did. And so 9 months after I had proposed the program of cultural heritage sensitivity training, it was approved. That meant that I could now organize a team of archaeologists to go to military bases and lecture on cultural heritage sensitivity of Iraq and Afghanistan. That was not as easy as I thought it would be. I was able to get permission early on to go to a series of bases, the Army base at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Camp Lejeune, the Marine base in North Carolina, Fort Dix in central New Jersey on lower left, where I still give these briefings. I still do these briefings 9 years later, but the fact that the U.S. Central Command says it's okay to give them doesn't mean you can just walk into a base and say, "Hello, here's archaeology." You have to get the approval of each of the base commanders. And so that was a different salesmanship issue. And so they asked me to, once I got in the door, they asked me to give the lecture for them first, because how did they know I wasn't a latter-day Jane Fonda or Tom Hayden or Abby Hoffman or someone like that? Many of you don't know who those people were, but you can imagine that they were not politically neutral in the Vietnam War, as indeed they weren't. So I gave them the lecture, and you see the first one I gave on upper right. This is at Camp Lejeune. They're wearing army fatigues. I'm wearing tweed, which is what our people wear. And they were very receptive to what I was lecturing on. The problem was, there were several problems. At the beginning, they said, "Well, you have," in some cases at Fort Bliss, they said, "Okay, you have 20 minutes. 20 minutes to present the history of all of Mesopotamia and Afghanistan and the fundamentals of historic preservation." So we're all used to condensing, but this was a new exercise in that. And then I had to convince other archaeologists that this was okay to do. There were plenty of anthropologists who felt that we were doing something inappropriate. We were collaborating with the military. We were part of the invasion. We were part of the problem rather than the solution. And so this is something we can also talk about during the question and answer session. And as I often say, some of the archaeologists I had tapped to do this were disenchanted with their reception by the Army. It's not to say that it was an unfriendly reception. It was a very friendly reception. But when you, as an academic, when you go on lecture tours, such as this one, everyone is phenomenally nice to you. They feed you magnificent dinners. They treat you almost like a king. You get used to that. It's a lovely thing. The Army isn't like that. And so people weren't used to someone saying, "You need to lecture to 500 soldiers in 5 minutes. It's there." And you can't say, "I was uninformed of this." You have to say, "Let's go." That's what you have to do. And not every academic was prepared to do this. So I did more of them than I was expecting. The vast majority. Finally, I turned to professors of archaeology who were Vietnam veterans, because they knew how the Army worked and they were willing to adapt to the routine that they found in place. And in time, they let me go to Iraq and Afghanistan and do the cultural heritage sensitivity training there and for longer periods of time. I always say this is my Michael Dukakis photograph, because some of you know that when Michael Dukakis ran for president, he had himself photographed in a tank, and he looked unnatural, as do I wearing body armor. But it was a war zone, so that's what you do. And so I learned how to condense the history of archaeology in the Near East and Central Asia and also to tell them something about historic preservation, because so many of them were going to be dealing with mud brick architecture, or they were going to be expanding bases where in digging down the earth would change from sandy to a dark brown. That would mean they were getting in the vicinity of a mud brick building, that's to say an ancient settlement, and they'd need to know to stop. I also needed to tell them what to do if they walked into a museum that had just been hit by a rocket. Of course, I had to learn how to do all of these things before I could teach it to the soldiers. This was not something one studies in graduate school. In fact, during the early years when reporters would call me as president-elect of AIA and say, what do you think of these particular treasures in Afghanistan? Well, I'd never studied the archaeology of Afghanistan. Fortunately, they were phone interviews. So, I could type it up on Wikipedia, as I was on the phone and say, that's a very difficult issue. There are a variety of ways to approach that issue, as I'm reading, the date and the importance of the treasure. But, you stretch yourself. That's what we do as academics. And so over time, I became an expert in these subjects, and I taught other archaeologists how they could effectively do the presentation. And I found others who were of the same mind and who wanted to contribute. One of them was the archaeologist at Fort Drum, Laurie Rush, who developed these cultural heritage sensitivity playing cards that were designed to highlight the lessons that I was giving them in the cultural heritage training sessions. And I just show you one enlarged on the right. How would we feel if someone destroyed the torch of the Statue of Liberty? What obviously we would feel devastated. What we were trying to communicate was the sense of loss that the residents of these countries feel when their antiquities are destroyed. And of course, a great number of those antiquities have been destroyed, some of them egregious examples of destruction. The colossal Buddhas in Bamiyan being a case in point. You see it before the destruction on the left, 53 meters high, 170 feet high, carved in the early 6th century AD, so what would be the reign of Justinian. And then, of course, the Taliban tied dynamite to the ankles and shoulders of the Buddha, and you see it now, an empty shell on the right, where there's been a great deal of discussion as to how this should be commemorated. Should the Buddha somehow be rebuilt, or would it be more powerful to leave it as a void? This kind of destruction, of course, has been widespread in the Near East in a variety of contexts. So, of course, we saw this in particular in 2003 when images of Saddam Hussein were in many cases blindfolded and then pulled down. And you see one of them on upper right, and then a destruction of another image of Saddam Hussein on lower right. This is something that continues a long process of iconoclasm, or damnationes, the defacement of images. You can take it back to at least the early 3rd millennium BC in Egypt, and plenty of places in Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq in the 3rd, 2nd, 1st millennium BC. And some think that the destruction of the images of the soldiers at Persepolis in what is now southwestern Iran, as you see on the left, were defaced by the soldiers of Alexander the Great when Alexander moved through this capital of the Persian Empire. It's sort of two bookends of image defacement, defacement of the images of rulers. And all of these developments have given rise recently to an interesting series of books, of which I single out only 3. One asking, are we Rome? Has America become ancient Rome? Another one, Jim Cuno, who was just down the road in Los Angeles at the Getty, asking who owns antiquity? What should our attitude be toward these objects that one sees on the art market, or as some of us would say, orphaned objects, objects that were bought a long time ago and have a cloudy heritage? And then Stephen Kahn's book, Do Museums Still Need Objects? Should we not worry at all about acquiring new objects or even keeping them? Should the emphasis be more on digital reconstructions and touch screens, which go over better with children than the actual objects? And I want to touch on each one of these issues in conclusion of this lecture. Are we Rome? We've all dealt with the issue of similarities and differences between the ancient world and the modern world. This next image is the one that I always think of. It's a very strong image, but if you look at the column of Trajan in Rome, which dates to the early 2nd century AD, you're seeing Roman soldiers holding the severed heads of their Dacian enemies. Dacia being ancient Romania. These heads have been severed and they're being held aloft to show to Trajan, the emperor, as war trophies. You can easily find comparable images on the web of the Taliban holding severed heads of their captives, and they're holding those heads in a sense in the same capacity that the Roman soldiers are holding the Dacian heads. These are war trophies in a sense. And so people ask me, what's the difference between antiquity and the modern period? There's a technological change, but otherwise I can't see a difference. I can't find it. Human nature, for me at least, is the same now as it had been in antiquity. The cast of characters have changed, the centers of power have changed, but the basic features of war, its commemoration, and its abuses continue unabated. Who owns antiquity? We've seen this dominate the news in so many recent accounts, especially in the last few years, where with the rise of nationalism in so many countries, including our own, we've seen a greater claim toward the antiquities, a greater claim for the repatriation of the antiquities that had left the countries of origin. So I'm showing you the demonstrations in Lima, Peru 3 years ago against Yale University when they were arguing for the return of the artifacts that had been taken by Hiram Bingham from Machu Picchu 100 years earlier. And of course, those antiquities were returned to Peru only a couple years ago. And you see the same sort of thing in the lower image with the human chain that had formed around the Cairo Archaeological Museum at the time of the Civil War, which of course is still ongoing, but this image from 2011, where the Egyptians, or a group of Egyptians, were so concerned about the loss of cultural heritage from that museum and mindful of what had happened to the Iraq Museum in Baghdad in 2003 that they formed a protective zone around it to protect it from any kind of theft. Even though there was theft, it was only about 50 objects. And there are new cards that are being played in the context of these claims for repatriation. So if we again look at the situation in Turkey, when they recently claimed a sphinx, part of a gate from Boğazköy, the capital of the Hittite Empire, ancient Hattusha, a few years ago. And Berlin, it was at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, and Berlin said, well, we're not going to give it back. You gave it to us in the 1920s, and Turkey said, show us the proof that we gave it to you. And they said the proof was in a group of papers that were in a building that was bombed during World War II, so we do not have the papers to show you, but really, you did give it to us. And so there was a new card played at that time where Turkey said, either give it back to us or lose the right to continue digging at the archaeological site where it was found, and lose the right to continue digging at any archaeological site in Turkey. Now, some of the most prominent excavations in Turkey are sites that have been dug, or the permit has been held by Germans for a very long period of time. Priene, Miletus, Pergamon, Hattusha, now Göbekli Tepe, this great early Neolithic site. So this was going to be a major change and a major impact on German archaeology. And in the end, they did give the Sphinx back. And so it's now at the Turkish site of Çorum. But this use of the right to conduct research in another country as leverage for the repatriation of antiquities was, in my experience, new. And I think that we'll see that in more cases. Sometimes there's a question as to what is art, or what is a monument, and what should be preserved, and how should it be preserved. And I always like to use this example as a case in point. When I was in southern Iraq, this is at the site of Ur, so you see the ziggurat of Ur behind me in upper right, and I was discussing with Abdul Amir Hamdani, the archaeological site supervisor for the district around Ur. We were discussing the House of Abraham, which you see on lower right. Abraham, of course, reportedly lived in Ur. And if he lived in Ur, he had a residence. Saddam Hussein built this residence from scratch. In 1999, he was hoping that the Pope, who had announced his intention to visit biblical pilgrimage sites in the Vatican's Jubilee year of 2000, would come to Ur on a papal visit if there was a house of Abraham for him to visit. So Saddam Hussein built a 40-room mansion for Abraham, which is perfectly ridiculous. Even the king of Ur didn't have a 40-room mansion, let alone Abraham, who probably had a mud brick hut. But he built it, and of course the Pope said, no, I'm not coming. Nevertheless, it still sat there and still sits there, and we were discussing whether or not, or what its fate should be. And I said, it's now part of the history of the site. It's part of the site's biography. And so don't destroy it. Put up a sign that indicates the extent to which the site has been used as a component of recent political propaganda. That's part of its narrative, but don't destroy it. The destruction of cultural property, which I would count this house as being, even though it's wholesale fabrication of Saddam Hussein, I think that never solves anything and interrupts the narrative richness of any site. And you can see his reaction to that appeal. The State Department photographer captured that moment. I mean, you can see my hands, I'm gesturing, let it stand. And he has his arms crossed over his chest saying, I want it destroyed. It still survives up to this point. But there's a great deal of cultural property, of course, that has been destroyed, and some would not necessarily call it cultural property, but I would. When I was in Afghanistan, southern Afghanistan 2 years ago, I was at Ghazni, which you see circled by the black rectangle on upper right, and you again see me in my Michael Dukakis body armor on upper left. That was my last day in Afghanistan. Was the day in which it was the day after the minister in Florida had burned the Quran. And so my last day was the day in which the news of the burning of the Quran had reached the people of Afghanistan. And many of you read about this at the time. There were riots all over the country. There were a number of people who died. There were Afghans who died. There were United Nations personnel who died. It was a terrible thing. I would count this as the same, I would put this in the same category of destruction of cultural property as I would all of the other objects that I've shown you. And so that begs the question, well, how do we stop all of this? What are the solutions? And of course, no one has an ideal solution as to what one can do. One of the things one can do is band together as archaeological organizations. So what I argued at the time was that we needed a kind of United Nations of archaeologists so that we would speak with one voice when cultural property was threatened again, as surely it will be. Because at the time in which the Iraq Museum was robbed, we didn't speak with one voice. Each archaeological organization wanted to be the one with the best message, the best solution, the most publicity. And so no one talked to anyone. I mean, we did, but it wasn't to the extent that it should have been. And so now the AIA, the Russian Academy of Sciences, the German Archaeological Institute, and plenty of other archaeological societies all over the world have signed an agreement saying, if this happens again, we will speak with one voice. Now that's easier said than done, but at least we've laid the groundwork for it. There are other developments that are noteworthy in this context. The Blue Shield, the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross, is now much stronger than it has been before, and they also are part of these cultural heritage sensitivity trainings for soldiers. And of course, it doesn't just work to do the training for soldiers. You need to train or ensure that the residents of these countries where cultural property is at risk are trained in the best conservation techniques. And so in the last few years, we've seen the foundation of the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, where Iraqi conservators are trained throughout the year in the conservation of both objects and archaeological sites. And of course, you have to be trained to be intolerant of other civilizations. You have to be taught to be intolerant of other people. It's not something that you're born feeling. So reaching out to children, starting cultural heritage sensitivity programs for children in every country is vital. And this is something that we've also started doing at the AIA, and something that I now do with increasing frequency in Philadelphia. Many of us who become academics think that, okay, now we only have to lecture to college-age students and graduate students, which is lots of fun. It's a different experience when you're lecturing to people in kindergarten where they have no temporal or spatial perspective, so that's really hard. But, or primary school, or God forbid, junior high school when they're going through puberty, that's hard. That's just very hard. But it's something that's the responsibility of all of us to reach out to children at an extraordinarily young age so that they learn the folly of this kind of intolerance. I always like to end my lectures with this slide. It's a photo of the Kabul Archaeological Museum in 2001 after the Taliban were ejected from, or at least their dominance over Kabul had ended. The bilingual sign in Dari and English that was erected above the entrance to the Kabul Archaeological Museum, saying a nation stays alive when its culture stays alive, and that's now memorialized in a plaque next to the entrance of the museum. Cultural heritage, of course, is a fragile thing, and the protection of that cultural heritage requires a group of resourceful, creative people, generation after generation, whether there's war or not, because we're going into a period where the war is gradually winding down, but we're seeing additional wars in other locations. We can't ever let up on these attempts, and many of you are already doing it, although you may not know it. Through your fieldwork, your research, your support for the humanities, you're already playing a vital role in the protection of cultural heritage, keeping cultural heritage alive, and thus you're keeping the nations alive associated with that cultural heritage. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for listening to me tonight. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.